Ukrainian forces are increasing their assaults on energy infrastructure in Russian-occupied Crimea. Moscow has been using the peninsula, which it annexed illegally in 2014, to launch attacks and supply Russian troops in southern Ukraine. Now, repeated Ukrainian drone strikes on Crimea's oil facilities have led to fuel rationing and food shortages.
Fuel restrictions in Crimea have been causing long queues for more than a week. Now the knock-on effects are being felt more broadly, with literal signs of food shortages. This one says more sugar is on its way, and some residents say food rationing is already happening.
They told us in the food store in Sevastopol that we can only buy 3 packs of noodles per person, but there aren't any bans in the suburb where I live.
Supply chains are being disrupted by Ukraine's almost daily strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. Moscow has acknowledged that's causing problems for Crimea.
Measures are being taken to ensure that this issue doesn't get any worse. Our Ministry of Energy is currently working on it. There are indeed certain problems, and a comprehensive set of measures is being developed to address the situation.
Russia illegally annexed Crimea in 2014, and the peninsula is usually a hub for Russian tourists over the summer months. It's also a key supply route for the Russian military, and Ukraine has been increasing drone attacks in the area. The attacks and fuel disruptions have reportedly led to a major drop in tourist traffic. Russian-appointed officials have confirmed the economy has taken a hit.
Dear Crimea residents, let me speak to you about the situation with automobile fuel shortages. I see and read all the comments that I receive daily on my social media. We are monitoring the news. We understand that the deficit of fuel impacts our region's economy.
Ukraine says the recent attacks on energy infrastructure aim to make Russia pay an economic cost for the war, which Moscow shows no signs of bringing to an end.
Christina Harward is a Russian analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. I asked her how significant the fuel and food shortages in Crimea are.
It's definitely very significant. We're starting to see a repeat of something that happened a bit last year in 2025. That was the gasoline shortages that really did affect areas of occupied Ukraine as well as into Russia. However, there's some key differences this year that we didn't see last year. For example, these shortages are starting much sooner this year. So the summertime is traditionally a very high demand season for fuel. And these shortages are starting at the very start of that demand season. So it'll be interesting to see how the Kremlin is able to handle this in the coming weeks and months. Whereas last year, the shortages really started to take shape towards the end of that high demand season. So very different situations.
Now, Crimea has been under Russian control since 2014. How has Ukraine managed to undermine Crimea's economic stability despite Russia's dominance there?
Yeah, so there's 2 different things going on right now that are really working together in a sort of synergy. First, we have the long-range strikes against Russian oil refineries and other energy infrastructure deep into Russian territory. Ukraine has really ramped up these strikes throughout 2026, and as the report at the start of this interview noted, we're seeing almost daily strikes against some really major targets affecting Russia's oil industry. And then on top of that, new this year in 2026 is Ukraine is really starting to ramp up their campaign with these middle range or operational range drone strikes. So these are going to be drone strikes against areas in the occupied parts of Ukraine. Particularly, they're targeting the Russian supply lines that go through Crimea, go through southern Ukraine, and go through eastern Ukraine as well. This is a new development, and so what's happening right now and why we're seeing the most acute issues happening in Crimea first is the nexus of these 2 strike campaigns. So first, you have the long-range strikes are causing the Russian fuel production to go down because they're not able to keep their refineries producing at 100%. Plus, on top of that, they can't get the fuel that they are able to produce to Crimea because the highways are largely very high-risk zones right now. And so it's really difficult to get any supplies to Crimea.
Now, fuel rationing has been in place for over a week now in Crimea. At what point does a logistics crisis like this start to have real military consequences for Russian forces in Crimea?
That is an excellent question. It's one that our team here at ISW is looking at every single day. We are starting to see some battlefield effects. So, for example, there was an unconfirmed report yesterday that Russian forces are having to withdraw from the parts of the Kinburn Spit in Mykolaiv Oblast that the Russians have occupied. There's the reports that they've had to withdraw because deliveries of things like ammunition, fuel, other supplies have just completely stopped reaching the troops in that area. So they had no other decision but to abandon their positions. Now, again, that's an unconfirmed report, so we are definitely keeping our eyes out for other instances of similar things happening in other parts of the front line. But beyond that, we are starting to see two things that are happening. One, we're starting to see issues as well with diesel supply. So this is going to be very important when thinking about military logistics because the Russian army is going to be more of a diesel-heavy army than gasoline. Of course, they're going to use gasoline for certain types of vehicles, but diesel is probably going to have a bigger effect on the battlefield.
Right.
The second thing that we're seeing happening right now is the Russians are having to reroute some of their supplies in southern Ukraine. So we're seeing reports that now instead of the trucks using the main highways, they're having to really stick to these smaller roads that hug the coast, so as far south as they can get. And this is going to slow down their logistics.
How would you address the way that the Kremlin is handling this situation?
Yeah, so I think we haven't seen a really huge Kremlin response. Last week was the big international economic forum in St. Petersburg, where Vladimir Putin always gives a big address. He didn't really touch on this crisis that was really already starting to develop in front of everyone's eyes. We have seen very limited responses from Kremlin officials, such as the spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, that was highlighted again in the report at the start of this. But his statement was really vague. He kept it pretty simple. He just said the Russian officials are working on the matter and they're trying to make sure it doesn't turn into a full-blown crisis. But so far, they've been relatively quiet on the issue out of the Kremlin.
Christina, thank you very much for speaking with us today. That was Christina Harward from the Institute for the Study of War in Washington, D.C.
Thank you.